Madam Speaker, excuse me, former Speaker Pelosi, this isn't one of those hearings where everyone pretends to be shocked and then goes home for fundraising. This is a face-to-face collision between a political legend who built her career outlasting every scandal cycle and a federal lawman who's walking in like the clock is already running on the record. December 15th, 2000. A classified briefing on Operation Warp Speed and vaccine distribution in the morning. Later that day, Paul Pelosi makes a multi-million-dollar options bet tied to Pfizer. The next day, the FDA announces emergency authorization. And suddenly, the room isn't talking about ideology or rhetoric or partisan attacks. It's talking about calendars, timestamps, and what's supposed to be coincidence. Kash Patel doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. He lays out a timeline the way you'd lay out a highway pileup, 1 mile marker at a time until the audience can't look away. Here's the briefing time. Here's the call time. Here's the broker call. Here's the trade execution. And then he asks the question that's simple enough to sound harmless, but sharp enough to land like a punch. How does this keep happening? Nancy Pelosi doesn't walk in looking like someone who expects to lose. She walks in looking like Nancy Pelosi, composed, polished, surrounded by attorneys, still carrying the muscle memory of power. She's survived Gingrich, Bush, Trump, and half a century of Washington's appetite for blood. If political pressure were a sport, she'd be a Hall of Famer. But this isn't political pressure. It's arithmetic. It's timing. It's patterns that don't care how famous you are. And the tension in that room isn't just did something improper happen. The tension is darker and more interesting than that. Because even if you assume every single trade had a clean explanation, you still have to answer a brutal question the public can't stop asking. Why do the luckiest trades in America keep showing up right next to the most sensitive meetings in Washington? That's the moment the hearing flips from policy to story. You can feel it when Patel turns a binder page and the lawyers lean forward. You can hear it in the silence right after he says, calmly, almost politely, "Let's talk about December 15th. Because everyone understands what's really happening. This isn't about one trade. It's about whether a system built on trust can survive the appearance that the people writing the rules might be playing by a different set. And once that question is in the air, nobody in the room gets to pretend it's just theater anymore. Patel doesn't start with accusations because accusations invite defenses. He starts with structure, with the kind of slow, methodical framing that makes people uneasy precisely because it feels so neutral. He talks about how financial investigations work, how analysts don't look for villains first, but for patterns, how they chart events on timelines and let correlations surface on their own. It sounds almost boring, which somehow makes it more unsettling, because nothing about the room feels boring anymore. He explains that when you track hundreds of trades over many years, you begin to see two kinds of behavior. One is noise, the random buying and selling most investors do based on headlines, gut feelings, or long-term plans. The other is signal, the trades that line up too cleanly with external events to ignore. Not illegal by definition, he's careful to say, but statistically unusual. The kind of unusual that makes analysts lean back in their chairs and ask whether they're really looking at chance or something else. Pelosi listens without interrupting. Her lawyers take notes. The committee members shift in their seats. Patel clicks to a slide showing two overlapping graphs. One is Paul Pelosi's trading activity. The other is Nancy Pelosi's official schedule. The lines don't match perfectly, but they touch often enough to make the room collectively lean forward. He points out that no single data point proves anything. It's the accumulation that matters. One coincidence is nothing. 10 coincidences raise eyebrows. 100 coincidences become a story. He highlights a cluster of dates, not naming them at first, just marking them as high-sensitivity events. Closed-door negotiations, classified briefings, confidential policy sessions. Then he overlays the trades. Again, no claims, just alignment. The implication forms on its own, like a shadow you notice before you realize what's casting it. Pelosi's attorney steps in, reminding everyone that members of Congress attend sensitive meetings constantly and that spouses trade stocks constantly, so overlap is inevitable. Patel nods. Of course overlap exists. The question, he says, is not whether overlap happens, but whether the rate and profitability of that overlap exceed what would reasonably be expected from random behavior. That's where things get interesting. He presents a comparison. When Paul Pelosi traded stocks in industries unrelated to Nancy's committee work, the returns looked average, sometimes even disappointing. But when the trades involved sectors directly affected by pending legislation or regulatory decisions, the returns spiked dramatically. Again, not illegal by itself, just remarkable. The room feels less like a hearing now and more like a graduate seminar in probability, except nobody is taking notes for a grade. They're taking notes for history. Patel asks a question that lands harder than any accusation could have. If you were designing an algorithm to detect insider advantages, what would it look for? Timing, relevance, repetition, profitability. And here, he says gently, are all four. Pelosi finally speaks, her voice steady but tighter than before. She repeats that she has never directed her husband's investments and that Paul has always acted independently. She reminds the room that disclosure rules were followed and that no regulator had ever charged her with wrongdoing. It's a strong defense, legally speaking, and it resonates with the part of the audience that still wants to believe the story ends there. But Patel doesn't challenge her directly. He pivots instead to perception, to how things look from the outside. He says that trust in institutions doesn't erode because of proven crimes alone. It erodes because of unresolved questions, because of patterns that never get fully explained. Even if every action was technically within the law, he asks, does it still inspire confidence when the financial outcomes of public officials appear so consistently aligned with private advantage? That's when the hearing starts to feel less about Pelosi and more about something larger. About whether modern politics can survive in a world where information itself is currency. About whether it's even realistic to expect lawmakers to separate their public roles from their private interests when both operate in the same economic ecosystem. One committee member, a Democrat, pushes back. He argues that targeting one figure risks turning structural problems into personal narratives. He warns that focusing too much on Pelosi distracts from broader reform. Patel agrees, surprisingly. He says, this investigation isn't about one person being uniquely suspicious. It's about illustrating how current rules create unavoidable gray zones. Pelosi just happens to be a high-profile example. That comment shifts the mood. For a moment, Pelosi doesn't look like a defendant. She looks like a case study, a symbol of a system that rewards proximity to power with opportunities most citizens will never see, whether anyone intends it or not. Patel then brings up phone records, not as proof of content, but as evidence of rhythm. He shows how, on days when Pelosi attended sensitive meetings, she often called her husband shortly afterward. That's normal, he says. Spouses talk. But he also shows that on those same days, Paul often contacted his broker within hours. Again, normal. Investors talk to brokers. What's unusual, Patel suggests, is how frequently this sequence repeats, and how often it precedes highly profitable trades. Pelosi's lawyer objects, pointing out that correlation does not equal causation. Patel agrees again. Correlation does not equal causation. But in investigative work, correlation is how causation is discovered or ruled out. It's the starting point, not the conclusion. The tension rises when Patel asks Pelosi a direct question. Did she ever discuss policy developments with her husband? Pelosi answers carefully, saying that she and her husband talk about many things, including general political issues, as any couple might. She does not specify content. She does not deny discussion. She keeps it vague. That vagueness becomes the story, not because it proves anything, but because it invites interpretation. Supporters say she's being prudent. Critics say she's being evasive. The hearing drifts into that uncomfortable space where every answer is technically safe, but emotionally unsatisfying. Patel asks about one specific date, again without alleging misconduct. He describes the sequence of events, the meeting, the call, the trade. He asks what they talked about. Pelosi pauses, consults her lawyers, and eventually invokes her Fifth Amendment right. It's a legal move, standard in high-stakes investigations, but politically radioactive. The room changes instantly. You can feel it in the way people stop shifting and start staring. Taking the fifth doesn't mean guilt, but it means the conversation just moved from public relations to legal survival. For someone who built a career on commanding narratives, that shift is dramatic. She invokes it again when asked about another date, and another. Each time the same phrase, delivered with less confidence than before. The committee members exchange looks. Even those sympathetic to her understand what this looks like on camera, even if cameras are technically not for broadcast. Patel doesn't press aggressively. He lets the silence do the work. He notes for the record that the witness declined to answer questions about specific communications. He then reframes the issue one last time, not as a question of crime, but of trust. He says that no democratic system can function if citizens believe their leaders have informational advantages that translate into personal wealth. Even the perception of such a system undermines legitimacy. Whether or not any laws were broken, the optics alone justify reform. Pelosi's lawyers argue that optics should not override rights, that public servants should not be punished for appearances. Patel agrees again, but points out that political legitimacy is not a legal concept. It's a social one. And social concepts are shaped by stories, not statutes. By the time the hearing adjourns, no verdict has been delivered, no charge announced, no confession made. Yet everyone in the room knows something irreversible has happened. The story has escaped the realm of rumor and entered the realm of documented uncertainty. Within hours, partial transcripts leak. Commentators argue about what invoking the fifth really means. Some insist it's simply legal caution. Others argue that an innocent person has nothing to hide. Neither side can prove its point, which only fuels the controversy. Pelosi releases a statement saying she has done nothing wrong and that the hearing was a politically motivated spectacle. Patel releases a statement saying the investigation is ongoing and that no conclusions should be drawn prematurely. Both statements are technically true, and both fail to calm the public. The internet does what it always does. It turns complexity into memes. Charts circulate comparing Pelosi's wealth growth to average congressional salaries. Jokes appear about congressional alpha funds and insider index ETFs. The humor is sharp, but the underlying anger is real. For many Americans, this isn't about Pelosi personally. It's about a feeling that the game is rigged, that those in power operate under a different set of economic rules. The hearing becomes a focal point for broader resentment about inequality, transparency, and access. Even some of Pelosi's longtime allies admit privately that the situation is damaging. Not because of any proven wrongdoing, but because of how perfectly it fits an existing narrative about elites and privilege. In politics, narratives often matter more than facts. The Department of Justice announces it is reviewing materials from the committee. The SEC confirms it is looking into related financial data. Both agencies stress that reviews do not imply charges. Still, the words federal review stick in headlines. Pelosi later announces she will not run for office again. She cites age, family, and the desire for a new generation of leadership. Officially, the decision has nothing to do with the hearing. Unofficially, nobody believes that timing is random. Months pass, no indictments appear, no lawsuits move forward. The story slowly fades from daily news cycles, replaced by newer scandals, newer outrages, newer hearings. But it never fully disappears. It becomes one of those political legends that resurface every time someone talks about congressional trading. In classrooms and think tanks, analysts discuss the case as an example of structural suspicion, a scenario where no one can definitively say a crime occurred, yet no one can confidently say everything was clean either. It's the kind of gray zone that democracies find hardest to manage. Pelosi's legacy becomes split. To her supporters, she remains a historic leader who reshaped American politics and faced unfair scrutiny. To her critics, she becomes the face of a system that rewards proximity to power with invisible advantages. And maybe that's the real outcome of the hearing. Not a conviction, not an acquittal, but a permanent question mark. A reminder that in modern politics, you don't always need proof to lose trust. Sometimes all it takes is a pattern that never quite gets explained. The confrontation between Kash Patel and Nancy Pelosi doesn't end with handcuffs or verdicts. It ends with something far more unsettling. A story that can't be closed. A narrative that sits in the public mind like an unfinished sentence, daring people to fill in the ending themselves. Because in the absence of clear answers, people will always write their own. And in politics, once the audience starts doing that, no amount of legal defense can fully take control of the script again. The months after the hearing drift into an uneasy kind of political afterlife, the sort where nothing technically changes, but everything feels different. Pelosi is no longer on stage every day, no longer issuing statements from the Capitol steps, no longer shaping headlines through sheer gravitational force. Yet her absence becomes a presence of its own, like a missing character in a long-running series whose storyline never quite resolves. Inside Washington, the conversation shifts from "what did she do" to "what does this mean?" Staffers who once treated congressional stock trading as a minor ethics footnote suddenly start speaking in lower voices about conflicts of interest, about how many members quietly hold portfolios that would make hedge fund managers jealous. The Pelosi hearing doesn't invent the problem, but it forces people to look at it without blinking. What makes the case linger isn't outrage, at least not the explosive kind. It's discomfort. The kind that comes from realizing that the system may be functioning exactly as designed, even if the design itself feels morally off. No bribes, no brown envelopes, no secret offshore accounts. Just people in power operating inside a framework that allows them to know more, sooner, and more precisely than anyone else in the market. Patel gives a follow-up interview months later, and he's careful with every word. He says investigations like this are never about one person. They're about stress-testing institutional trust. He avoids Pelosi's name almost entirely, speaking instead about high-profile examples and public perception. He says The hardest cases aren't the ones where guilt is obvious, but the ones where everything sits in a gray zone between legal and legitimate. That distinction becomes the quiet theme of the whole saga. Legal versus legitimate. Technically allowed versus socially acceptable. It's a gap that law can't easily close, because law operates on proof, while legitimacy operates on belief. And belief is shaped by patterns, not statutes. On cable news, the story mutates into culture war content. One side frames Pelosi as a victim of political targeting, a powerful woman punished for her success. The other frames her as the embodiment of elite hypocrisy. Both sides recycle the same facts, but tell different emotional stories. One talks about rights, the other talks about fairness. Neither can fully prove its case, which only entrenches the divide. Meanwhile, Congress passes new restrictions on stock trading for lawmakers and their families. The bill is marketed as reform, but privately, many members admit it's damage control. Not because of Pelosi specifically, but because the public mood has shifted. Voters no longer see congressional trading as a niche ethics issue. They see it as symbolic of a broader problem, a political class that seems insulated from the economic realities it governs. Pelosi herself becomes quieter. She declines most interviews. When she does speak, she frames the entire episode as an example of how modern politics feeds on suspicion. She says investigations create headlines even when they end without conclusions, and that reputations can be altered permanently without anyone ever being formally accused of anything. She doesn't deny the patterns. She just refuses to interpret them the way others do. That refusal becomes its own kind of statement. Not a confession, not a defense, just a posture of distance. Supporters say she owes the public nothing more than what the law requires. Critics say that's exactly the problem, that public trust requires more than legal compliance. Over time, the story seeps into academic discussions. Economists talk about information asymmetry. Political theorists talk about elite capture. Sociologists talk about institutional legitimacy. Nobody can use Pelosi's name in a textbook as proof of wrongdoing, but everyone uses her case as a hypothetical that feels uncomfortably real. One professor describes it this way. Imagine a world where doctors are allowed to bet on pharmaceutical stocks while working on clinical trials. Even if no doctor ever cheats, the perception alone would destroy confidence in medicine. The Pelosi case, he argues, creates the same dilemma for democracy. The system might not be corrupt, but it looks like it could be, and that's almost as damaging. In the public imagination, the hearing room becomes a kind of symbolic space. Not just a physical place, but a moment when the curtain was pulled back slightly on how power actually operates. The spreadsheets, the call logs, the careful language, the repeated invocation of rights. None of it proves a crime. All of it suggests a story that never quite gets told. Years later, when younger politicians are asked about the episode, they talk about it the way people talk about famous unsolved mysteries, not with anger, but with curiosity. They say it changed how they think about personal finances in public office. They say it made them more cautious, more aware of how optics can spiral into narratives that outlive any factual resolution. Pelosi's own legacy continues to fracture along generational lines. Older supporters remember her as a strategic mastermind who delivered legislative victories and reshaped party politics. Younger voters often remember her first as the stock trading controversy lady before learning about anything else she did. History, it seems, doesn't always preserve accomplishments in the order people expect. The most unsettling part of the entire story is that it never produces a clear moral ending. There is no villain defeated, no hero vindicated, no final report that closes the file forever. Instead, there is just a lingering sense that modern political systems have outgrown the ethical frameworks meant to regulate them. The confrontation between Patel and Pelosi becomes less about two individuals and more about a philosophical question. Can a democracy built on transparency exist with a financial system built on information advantage? And if not, which one has to change? In that sense, the hearing doesn't resolve anything. It destabilizes assumptions. It forces people to confront the possibility that legality is not the same as integrity, and that public trust can be eroded without a single law being broken. Pelosi never publicly answers the questions that made the room go silent that day. Patel never publicly claims wrongdoing. The story exists in a permanent state of suspension, like a verdict that was never delivered but still feels emotionally implied. And maybe that's why it remains so powerful, because it mirrors how many Americans feel about politics itself. Not angry enough to revolt, not convinced enough to believe, just stuck in that uneasy middle space where something feels off, but nobody can quite prove why. The hearing becomes a metaphor for modern governance, a clash between evidence and narrative, between data and interpretation, between what can be shown and what can be trusted. No scandal, no redemption, just a slow erosion of certainty. In the end, the most damaging thing about the Pelosi episode isn't what happened in the room. It's what happened afterward, in the collective imagination. Once people start asking whether power comes with invisible advantages, those questions don't go away just because investigations end. They sit there, quietly, shaping how every future action is interpreted. Every trade, every disclosure, every closed-door meeting. The story teaches people not what to believe, but how to doubt. And in politics, doubt is rarely temporary. It doesn't fade with headlines. It becomes part of the background noise, the static hum beneath every speech and every promise. You don't hear it consciously, but it changes how everything sounds. That's the real aftermath of the confrontation. Not a downfall, not a victory, but a shift in tone. A subtle but permanent recalibration of how Americans listen to their leaders. No verdict, no confession, just a question that never quite leaves the room. What makes that question so persistent is that it doesn't demand an answer in the usual way. It doesn't ask for documents or testimony or sworn statements. It asks for something far more elusive: reassurance. And reassurance is the one thing modern politics seems structurally incapable of producing. Because even when every investigation ends with no charges filed, the underlying unease doesn't reset to zero. It just goes quiet for a while, waiting for the next example, the next headline, the next moment where private wealth and public power intersect a little too neatly. The Pelosi episode becomes a reference point, a mental shortcut people use to interpret news stories before they even read the details. A new senator buys tech stocks before a major antitrust bill. A committee chair's spouse invests in defense contractors ahead of budget negotiations. None of it has to be proven improper for the reaction to be immediate. Here we go again. The public no longer starts from trust and moves toward doubt. It starts from doubt and waits to see if trust can be earned back. And that reversal is subtle but profound. For most of American history, political scandals were exceptions, disruptions in an otherwise assumed framework of legitimacy. Now, they feel like the background condition, the default state of affairs that only occasionally breaks in the direction of integrity. The Pelosi hearing didn't create that mindset, but it crystallized it. It gave people a concrete image for an abstract fear, A powerful figure, a binder of financial records, a series of unanswered questions. No explosion, no confession, just a long pause where clarity should have been. In media studies, there's a concept called narrative closure, the idea that stories feel satisfying when they resolve tension with a clear outcome. The Pelosi story offers the opposite: narrative suspension, a tension that never resolves, only mutates. It's not a scandal you can wrap up with a verdict. It's a mood that settles into the political atmosphere and stays there. That's why, years later, journalists still reference that hearing when discussing transparency or ethics reform. Not because it proved anything, but because it symbolized something. It marked the moment when conflict of interest stopped sounding like a technical phrase and started sounding like a cultural diagnosis. Pelosi herself fades into a quieter chapter of political life. She writes memoirs, gives the occasional speech, is honored at party events for her legislative achievements. The crowd applauds. The cameras flash. But the applause always carries a faint undertone, as if everyone is aware that the story being celebrated is only half the story people remember. Her defenders emphasize that she was never convicted, never even formally charged. And they're right. Her critics emphasize that she never fully answered the questions that defined the hearing. And they're also right. Both sides can claim factual accuracy. Neither side can fully claim moral closure. That unresolved duality becomes the template for how future controversies are processed. The public doesn't wait for outcomes anymore. It forms impressions in real time, based on fragments, patterns, and vibes. Investigations don't end scandals. They just stretch them across longer timelines, turning them into slow-burning background narratives. In that sense, the Pelosi episode isn't a political drama. It's a cultural shift. It marks the point where legitimacy stops being something institutions possess by default and becomes something they have to constantly perform, defend, and renegotiate. The irony is that no one involved seems to have intended that outcome. Patel framed his work as technical. Pelosi framed her silence as legal. Congress framed reform as procedural. Everyone stayed within their roles. And yet, the combined effect of those perfectly rational actions produced something deeply irrational. A widespread feeling that the system is hiding in plain sight. Maybe that's the real danger of modern political life. Not corruption in the cinematic sense, with villains and schemes, but a kind of ambient opacity, where everything is explainable individually, but unsettling collectively. You can explain one trade. You can explain one phone call. You can explain one refusal to answer. But when you stack enough explanations on top of each other, they start to feel less like clarity and more like fog. And people are remarkably sensitive to fog. They may not know what's behind it, but they know they can't see through it. So they assume the worst, not out of malice, but out of self-protection. In a world where trust feels risky, skepticism becomes the default survival strategy. That's why the hearing still matters, long after the transcript stopped trending. Not because it revealed a hidden truth, but because it exposed a visible uncertainty. It showed how fragile institutional credibility has become, how easily it can be shaken by patterns alone. The question that opened the confrontation still lingers, not as an accusation, but as a mirror. When political power and financial success align too neatly, what does the public owe its leaders? Blind faith, legal patience, or relentless scrutiny, even when it feels uncomfortable? There is no official answer to that question. No Supreme Court ruling, no ethics statute, no reform bill can fully resolve it. It exists in the space between law and legitimacy, between what is allowed and what feels right. And as long as that space exists, stories like this will never really end. They will just evolve, attach themselves to new names, new faces, new hearings. The details will change. The mood won't. Because once people start listening for patterns instead of promises, they don't stop. They scan timelines, they cross-reference headlines. They ask questions that no longer need to be proven to feel real. The Pelosi episode taught the public something subtle but enduring. In modern politics, silence can be louder than scandal, and uncertainty can be more corrosive than guilt. Not because it confirms anything, but because it refuses to close the loop. And in a system built on trust, an open loop is often the most destabilizing outcome of all.